On a Thursday afternoon in April, a fire-gutted Aston Martin was wheeled onto an auction floor outside Manchester, New Hampshire. Its paint was gone, its cabin was ash. The plate that should have carried its identity had melted into an unreadable smear of metal. Opening bid, $200. 63 collectors sat in that room. Not one of them lifted a hand. They looked at it the way people look at something they've already decided is finished. Then a man in the back row stood up. He wasn't wearing a suit. There was still a line of grease under his fingernails from the oil change he'd finished 4 hours earlier. He walked to the front, looked at the wreck for 11 seconds, and raised his hand. You're about to find out exactly what those 62 people missed, and exactly what it cost them to miss it. Shaw and Ellery Auctions had built its reputation over 16 years on exactly this kind of room: the polished floors, the recessed lighting, the sense that everyone inside had already been vetted before they sat down. Renata Shaw had founded it in her 30s and run it since, with a kind of unhurried precision that made people trust her judgment, without asking too many questions about how she reached it. When Lot 33 came up in the catalog, a 1961 Aston Martin DB4 GT, fire-damaged, provenance unconfirmed, she had already decided it didn't matter. Her in-house appraiser, Grant Foley, had looked over the intake photographs 2 weeks earlier from the comfort of his office and delivered a verdict that took him 4 minutes. Total loss, no structural integrity worth insuring, sell it for scrap value and move on. He hadn't driven out to see it. He hadn't needed to, as far as he was concerned. Renata set the opening bid at $200, not because she expected competition, but because auction paperwork requires a number greater than 0. In the third row, Marcus Whitfield, 61 years old, a watch on his wrist worth more than most houses. 30 years deep into a private collection of post-war European sports cars, didn't bother lowering his voice when he leaned toward the man beside him and said it looked like something dragged out of a chimney fire. The man beside him laughed. Nobody objected. The room had already agreed with Marcus before he said it out loud. He was only the one willing to say it where people could hear it. That kind of certainty is expensive. Nobody in that room yet understood exactly how expensive it was about to become. Caleb Reyes had almost skipped the auction entirely. He ran a single-bay garage on the industrial edge of Manchester, the kind of shop that survived on brake jobs and timing belts, not classic restorations. He was 34, widowed for going on 3 years, and most nights, the only thing waiting for him after closing was his daughter Josie's homework spread across the kitchen table, and a load of laundry he hadn't gotten to. He'd found the auction catalog on his phone at 11 at night, scrolling with the specific tired attention of someone who wasn't really looking for anything. He nearly passed Lot 33 the way everyone else eventually would. One more blurry photo of one more burned-out shell. But Caleb had spent 4 years in his 20s working under Desmond Voss, a panel beater who'd shaped aluminum by hand at Aston Martin's Newport Pagnell, works for the better part of 4 decades before retiring to a workshop outside Manchester. Almost by accident, because his daughter had settled there. Desmond hadn't taught Caleb to fix cars so much as to read them, to look at a roofline or a wheel arch and know the way you'd recognize someone's handwriting, whether it truly belonged to the shape it claimed to be. Something about the photo didn't sit right. The A-pillar leaned back at an angle Caleb didn't associate with a standard DB4. The proportions looked compressed. Wrong, like the car in the picture was quietly disagreeing with its own catalog description. He didn't mention any of this to anyone. He set his alarm for 5, laid out Josie's clothes for school, and told her at breakfast that he might be gone most of the day. "Are you going to buy a car?" she asked, not looking up from her cereal. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now." She considered this, with the seriousness 7-year-olds reserve for things adults think they're too young to take seriously, then went back to her cereal, satisfied enough. He dropped her at his sister's before sunrise and drove the 90 minutes to the auction, with the photo still open on his phone in the cup holder, checking it at every red light like it might have changed. He paid the $200 in cash at a folding table, while Renata Shaw watched from across the room, filing away the detail of his coveralls and the truck he'd backed up to the loading dock. She didn't say anything. Lot 34 was already coming up, and it was a Ferrari, and Ferraris held the room's attention in a way a burned shell of uncertain origin never would. Caleb winched the wreck onto a trailer and drove it south. And it wasn't until it was sitting under the shop's work lights that he let himself actually look at it. He didn't touch it for the first 20 minutes. He just sat on an overturned bucket and looked, the way Desmond had taught him to look. Not for what a thing was supposed to be, but for what it actually was. Then he got to work. The wheelbase came first. He measured it twice with a steel tape, because the number he got didn't match anything in the standard DB4 catalog. It was shorter, tighter, built for something closer to a race circuit than a road. Next was the metal itself. He scraped a 3-inch square of soot from a rear quarter panel and found aluminum underneath, hand-formed, carrying the faint irregular dimpling that only comes from a hammer worked by an actual person rather than a stamping press. Machines don't leave that signature. People do. By the second day, he'd worked his way to the firewall, brushing away decades of carbon with a soft brass brush, one careful pass at a time, until raised lettering emerged from the grime. A partial chassis code, a prefix he didn't recognize, followed by a number, 004. He called Desmond that night. Does the number 004 mean anything to you? There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Caleb checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Desmond exhaled, slow, the way a person breathes out when they finally set down something they've been carrying a long time. Where did you find that number? Caleb told him. Desmond didn't say much else that night, only that he'd be over first thing in the morning, and that Caleb shouldn't touch anything else until he got there. What Desmond confirmed, standing in the garage the next day with his hand pressed flat against the rear quarter panel, was this. In 1963, Aston Martin had quietly built 4 lightweight DB4 GT prototypes, cars stripped for competition, never catalogued, never sold to the public, under an internal designation that never made it into any owner's registry. 3 had been accounted for over the decades in varying states of restoration. The 4th had reportedly burned in a test track fire outside Silverstone in the spring of 1963, and had been written off as destroyed for 61 years. Desmond had shaped its rear panels himself as a 26-year-old apprentice in the final weeks before it disappeared from the factory's own records. I always wondered where this one went, he said quietly, his palm still resting against the metal. I didn't think I'd still be alive to find out. Neither of them said anything for a while after that. Some silences don't need filling. The letter arrived on the 5th day, from a law firm representing Shaw and Ellery Auctions. It didn't use the word fraud. It didn't have to. It talked instead about the terms of an as-is sale, and the auction house's right to revisit a transaction if a lot's description turned out to be materially inaccurate. Language built to sound procedural while doing something much more pointed underneath it. Caleb read it twice, put it in a drawer under his workbench, and went back to cleaning aluminum. He hadn't lied to anyone. He hadn't known anything the room hadn't had equal opportunity to see. He'd simply looked at what was already there. Marcus Whitfield showed up 2 days after that, alone, in a coat that cost more than Caleb's truck. He stood just inside the garage door for a long moment, longer than the glance he'd given the car in the auction room, and then offered $40,000, cash, no questions. Caleb, holding a rag-stained gray with decades of soot, said it wasn't for sale. Marcus doubled the number. Caleb gave him the same answer. That's a serious offer for a shop like this, Marcus said, glancing around at the single bay, the space heater, the drawing taped to the wall that Josie had made of a car with a sun over it. You had 30 seconds with this car in that room, Caleb said, not raising his voice. You decided it was worth nothing. That decision's already been made. Marcus left without another word. He wasn't used to being told no by a man in a garage, but there are certain kinds of refusal that even money recognizes it can't argue with. And he'd apparently encountered enough of them in 61 years to know this was one. What Caleb couldn't control was Sam Ortiz, who split shop duties with Caleb and had a habit of filming things Caleb generally wished he wouldn't. Had posted a 6-second clip of the car under the work lights. No caption, no explanation, just the aluminum glowing gold under the halogens. That unmistakable low, stripped-down profile. He hadn't said what it was. He hadn't needed to. By the next morning, it had been viewed 900,000 times. 3 separate car forums had identified the shape by the afternoon. Caleb's shop phone rang 11 times before noon, and he answered none of them. Renata Shaw heard about it from a broker who called her desk to ask, carefully, whether she had any concerns about how Lot 33 had been handled. She told him the sale was final, and she had no comment. Then she sat at her desk for a long time afterward, looking at a photo of the car on her screen, doing the quiet arithmetic of exactly how much trust she'd placed in a 4-minute phone verdict she'd never bothered to double-check herself. Miriam Clark arrived from the Aston Martin Heritage Trust on the 9th day with a case of testing equipment and a folder of original 1963 build records. She spent 4 hours photographing, measuring, and comparing the car against factory drawings that hadn't been pulled from the archive in decades. She didn't say much while she worked. At the end of it, she peeled off her gloves and told Caleb, in the careful voice of someone choosing words for a fact that would matter to a great many people, that this was without reasonable doubt the 4th Sanction Zero prototype, chassis 004, missing since 1963. The formal certification arrived by email 2 days later. Caleb read it once at his kitchen table, coffee going cold beside him, and thought about a hand pressed flat against a rear quarter panel. He didn't call an auction house. He called the Heritage Trust directly and asked who the most serious buyer for a car like this would be, not the highest bidder, the most serious one. Miriam gave him the name of a nonprofit automotive museum in Ohio that had spent a decade quietly acquiring and publicly displaying exactly this era of factory prototype, free admission, school tours every week of the term. Their acquisition director flew out 2 days later, walked around the car twice without touching it, and offered $10 million, wire transfer within 72 hours, full insured transport. Caleb had one condition. The placard next to it, he said. It has to carry his name. Desmond Voss, Newport Pagnell, 1963, permanently. The director didn't hesitate, of course. When Caleb told Desmond that night, the old man walked over to the car, pressed both palms flat against the panel he'd shaped 61 years earlier, and stood there with his eyes closed for a long moment. When he opened them, he said the metal remembered things longer than people gave it credit for, and that it had been waiting a long time to be seen properly again. Nobody said anything else for a while. There wasn't anything that needed adding to that. In the weeks that followed, Shaw and Ellery quietly changed its intake policy, requiring in-person inspection of every consigned vehicle before a lot description could be finalized. No public statement was made about why. Marcus Whitfield never mentioned the car again to anyone as far as Caleb ever heard. Caleb kept working in the same coveralls, out of the same single bay, on the same oil changes and brake jobs that had paid his bills for years. He hired Sam on full-time. He paid off his equipment loan. He started a small scholarship in his late wife's name for the children of working mechanics who wanted to study automotive restoration. On a Friday evening, he and Josie ate dinner at the kitchen table above the shop. Her drawing of the car with the sun over it still taped to the wall. She asked where it had gone. Ohio, he told her. Somewhere with big windows where people come to look at it properly. Is it happy there? He thought about Desmond's hands on the aluminum, about a $200 receipt folded in his wallet, about 14 days that had changed nothing about who he was, and everything about what he now understood he was capable of noticing. I think so, he said. It waited a long time to be seen. Now it is. 63 people stood in that room and looked at a burned-out shell. 63 people saw nothing worth their time. One man looked at the same wreck and asked a different question. That's the whole difference, in the end. Not luck and not money. The next time you walk past something everyone else has already decided isn't worth a second look. Remember what was sitting in that room for $200. Look a little longer. You might be the only one who does.